Citizens of Russia, friends, my address concerns the events in Ukraine and why this is so important for us, for Russia. Of course, my message is also addressed to our compatriots in Ukraine. The matter is very serious and needs to be discussed in depth. The situation in Donbass has reached a critical, acute stage. I am speaking to you directly today, not only to explain what is happening, but also to inform you of the decisions being made, as well as potential further steps. I would like to emphasize again that Ukraine is not just a neighboring country for us. It is an inalienable part of our own history, culture, and spiritual space. These are our comrades, those dearest to us. Not only colleagues, friends, and people who once served together, but also relatives, people bound by blood, by family ties. Since time immemorial, the people living in the southwest of what has historically been Russian land have called themselves Russians and Orthodox Christians. This was the case before the 17th century, when a portion of this territory rejoined the Russian state, and after. It seemed to us that, generally speaking, we all know these facts. That is common knowledge. Still, it is necessary to say at least a few words about the history of this issue in order to understand what is happening today, to explain the motives behind Russia's actions and what we aim to achieve. I will start with the fact that modern Ukraine was entirely created by Russia, or, to be more precise, by Bolshevik communist Russia. This process started practically right after the 1917 revolution. And Lenin and his associates did it in a way that was extremely harsh on Russia, by severing what is historically Russian land. Nobody asked the millions of people living there what they thought. Then, both before and after the Great Patriotic War, Stalin incorporated in the USSR and transferred to Ukraine some lands that previously belonged to Poland, Romania, and Hungary. In the process, he gave Poland part of what was traditionally German land as compensation. And in 1954, Khrushchev took Crimea away from Russia, for some reason, and also gave it to Ukraine. In effect, this is how the territory of modern Ukraine was formed. But now, I would like to focus attention on the initial period of the USSR's formation. I believe this is extremely important for us. I will have to approach it from a distance, so to speak. I will remind you that after the 1917 October Revolution and the subsequent Civil War, the Bolsheviks set about creating a new statehood. They had rather serious disagreements among themselves on this point. In 1922, Stalin occupied the positions of both the General Secretary of the Russian Communist Party, Bolsheviks, and the People's Commissar for Ethnic Affairs. He suggested building the country on the principles of auto-nominalization, that is, giving the republics, the future administrative and territorial entities, broad powers upon joining a unified state. Lenin criticized this plan and suggested making concessions to the nationalists, whom he called independents at that time. Lenin's ideas of what amounted in essence to a confederative state arrangement and a slogan about the right of nations to self-determination up to secession were laid in the foundation of Soviet statehood. Initially, they were confirmed in the declaration on the formation of the USSR in 1922, and later on, after Lenin's death, were enshrined in the 1924 Soviet Constitution. This immediately raises many questions. The first is really the main one. Why was it necessary to appease the nationalists? To satisfy the ceaselessly growing nationalist ambitions on the outskirts of the former empire? What was the point of transferring to the newly, often arbitrarily formed administrative units the Union republics, vast territories that had nothing to do with them? Let me repeat that these territories were transferred along with the population of what was historically Russia. Moreover, these administrative units were de facto given the status and form of national state entities. That raises another question. Why was it necessary to make such generous gifts beyond the wildest dreams of the most zealous nationalists, and on top of all that, give the republics the right to secede from the unified state without any conditions? At first glance, this looks absolutely incomprehensible, even crazy. But only at first glance. There is an explanation. After the revolution, the Bolsheviks' main goal was to stay in power at all costs. Absolutely all costs. They did everything for this purpose, accepted the humiliating Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Although the military and economic situation in an imperial Germany and its allies was dramatic, and the outcome of the First World War was a foregone conclusion, and satisfied any demands and wishes of the nationalists within the country. When it comes to the historical destiny of Russia and its peoples, Lenin's principles of state development were not just a mistake, they were worse than a mistake, as the saying goes. This became patently clear after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. Of course, we cannot change past events, but we must at least admit them openly and honestly, without any reservations or politicking. Personally, I can add that no political factors, however impressive or profitable they may seem at any given moment, can or may be used as the fundamental principles of statehood. I am not trying to put the blame on anyone. The situation in the country at that time, both before and after the Civil War, was extremely complicated. It was critical. The only thing I would like to say today is that this is exactly how it was. It is a historical fact. Actually, as I have already said, Soviet Ukraine is the result of the Bolsheviks' policy and can be rightly called Vladimir Lenin's Ukraine. He was its author and architect. This is fully and comprehensively corroborated by archival documents, including Lenin's harsh instructions regarding Donbass, which was actually shoved into Ukraine. And today, the grateful progeny has overturned monuments to Lenin in Ukraine. They call it decommunization. You want decommunization? Very well. This suits us just fine. But why stop halfway? We are ready to show what real decommunizations would mean for Ukraine. Going back to history, I would like to repeat that the Soviet Union was established in the place of the former Russian Empire in 1922. But practice showed immediately that it was impossible to preserve or govern such a vast and complex territory on the amorphous principles that amounted to confederation. They were far removed from reality and the historical tradition. It is logical that the Red Terror and a rapid slide into Stalin's dictatorship the domination of the communist ideology and the Communist Party's monopoly on power, nationalization and the planned economy, all this transformed the formally declared but ineffective principles of government into a mere declaration. In reality, the Union republics did not have any sovereign rights, none at all. The practical result was the creation of a tightly centralized and absolutely unitary state. In fact, what Stalin fully implemented was not Lenin's, but his own principles of government. But he did not make the relevant amendments to the cornerstone documents, to the Constitution. And he did not formally revise Lenin's principles underlying the Soviet Union. From the look of it, there seemed to be no need for that, because everything seemed to be working well in conditions of the totalitarian regime, and outwardly it looked wonderful, attractive, and even super democratic. And yet, it is a great pity that the fundamental and formally legal foundations of our state were not promptly cleansed of the odious and utopian fantasies inspired by the revolution, which are absolutely destructive for any normal state. As it often happened in our country before, nobody gave any thought to the future. It seemed that the Communist Party leaders were convinced that they had created a solid system of government, and that their policies had settled the ethnic issue for good. But falsification, misconception, and tampering with public opinion have a high cost. The virus of nationalist ambitions is still with us, and the mine laid at the initial stage to destroy state immunity to the disease of nationalism was ticking. As I have already said, the mine was the right of secession from the Soviet Union. In the mid-1980s, the increasing socioeconomic problems and the apparent crisis of the planned economy aggravated the ethnic issue, which essentially was not based on any expectations or unfulfilled dreams of the Soviet peoples, but primarily the growing appetites of the local elites. However, instead of analyzing the situation, taking appropriate measures, first of all in the economy, and gradually transforming the political system and government in a well-considered and balanced manner, the Communist Party leadership only engaged in open double-talk about the revival of the Leninist principle of national self-determination. Moreover, in the course of power struggle within the Communist Party itself, each of the opposing sides, in a bid to expand its support base, started to thoughtlessly incite and encourage nationalist sentiments, manipulating them and promising their potential supporters whatever they wished. Against the backdrop of the superficial and populist rhetoric about democracy and a bright future based either on a market or a planned economy, but amid a true impoverishment of people and widespread shortages, no one among the powers that be was thinking about the inevitable tragic consequences for the country. Next, they entirely embarked on the track beaten at the inception of the USSR, and pandering to the ambitions of the nationalist elites nurtured within their own party ranks. But, in so doing, they forgot that the CPSU no longer had, thank God, the tools for retaining power and the country itself. Tools such as state terror and a Stalinist-type dictatorship, and that the notorious guiding role of the party was disappearing without a trace, like a morning mist, right before their eyes. And then, September 1989 plenary session of the CPSU Central Committee approved a truly fatal document. The so-called ethnic policy of the party in modern conditions, the CPSU platform. It included the following provisions. I quote, "The republics of the USSR shall possess all the rights appropriate to their status as sovereign socialist states." The next point, "The supreme representative bodies of power of the USSR republics can challenge and suspend the operation of the USSR government's resolutions and directives in their territory." And finally, "Each republic of the USSR shall have citizenship of its own, which shall apply to all of its residents." Wasn't it clear what these formulas and decisions would lead to? Now is not the time or place to go into matters pertaining to state or constitutional law, or define the concept of citizenship. But one may wonder, why was it necessary to rock the country even more in that already complicated situation? Facts remain facts. Even 2 years before the collapse of the USSR, its fate was actually predetermined. It is now that radicals and nationalists, including and primarily those in Ukraine, are taking credit for having gained independence. As we can see, this is absolutely wrong. The disintegration of our united country was brought about by the historic, strategic mistakes on the part of the Bolshevik leaders and the CPSU leadership. Mistakes committed at different times in state building and in economic and ethnic policies. The collapse of the historical Russia, known as the USSR, is on their conscience. Despite all these injustices, lies, and outright pillage of Russia, it was our people who accepted the new geopolitical reality that took shape after the dissolution of the USSR and recognized the new independent states. Not only did Russia recognize these countries, but helped its CIS partners, even though it faced a very dire situation itself. This included our Ukrainian colleagues, who turned to us for financial support many times from the very moment they declared independence. Our country provided this assistance while respecting Ukraine's dignity and sovereignty. According to expert assessments, confirmed by a simple calculation of our energy prices, the subsidized loans Russia provided to Ukraine, along with economic and trade preferences, the overall benefit for the Ukrainian budget in the period from 1991 to 2013 amounted to $250 billion. However, there was more to it than that. By the end of 1991, the USSR owed some $100 billion to other countries and international funds. Initially, there was this idea that all former Soviet republics will pay back these loans together in the spirit of solidarity and proportionally to their economic potential. However, Russia undertook to pay back all Soviet debts and delivered on this promise by completing this process in 2017. In exchange for that, the newly independent states had to hand over to Russia part of the Soviet foreign assets. However, Kiev failed to ratify these agreements and later simply refused to honor them by making demands. For a share of the diamond treasury, gold reserves, as well as former USSR property and other assets abroad. Nevertheless, despite all these challenges, Russia always worked with Ukraine in an open and honest manner, and, as I have already said, with respect for its interests. We developed our ties in multiple fields. Thus, in 2011, bilateral trade exceeded $50 billion. Let me note that in 2019, that is before the pandemic, Ukraine's trade with all EU countries combined was below this indicator. At the same time, it was striking how the Ukrainian authorities always preferred dealing with Russia in a way that ensured that they enjoy all the rights and privileges while remaining free from any obligations. The officials in Kiev replaced partnership with a parasitic attitude, acting at times in an extremely brash manner. Suffice it to recall the continuous blackmail on energy transits and the fact that they literally stole gas. I can add that Kiev tried to use dialogue with Russia as a bargaining chip in its relations with the West, using the threat of closer ties with Russia for blackmailing the West to secure preferences by claiming that otherwise Russia would have a bigger influence in Ukraine. At the same time, the Ukrainian authorities, I would like to emphasize this, began by building their statehood on the negation of everything that united us, trying to distort the mentality and historical memory of millions of people, of entire generations living in Ukraine. It is not surprising that Ukrainian society was faced with the rise of far-right nationalism, which rapidly developed into aggressive Russophobia and neo-Nazism. This resulted in the participation of Ukrainian nationalists and neo-Nazis in the terrorist groups in the North Caucasus, and the increasingly loud territorial claims to Russia. A role in this was played by external forces, which used a ramified network of NGOs and special services to nurture their clients in Ukraine and to bring their representatives to the seats of authority. It should be noted that Ukraine actually never had stable traditions of real statehood, and therefore, in 1991, it opted for mindlessly emulating foreign models, which have no relation to history or Ukrainian realities. Political government institutions were readjusted many times to the rapidly growing clans and their self-serving interests, which had nothing to do with the interests of the Ukrainian people. Essentially, the so-called pro-Western civilizational choice made by the oligarchic Ukrainian authorities was not and is not aimed at creating better conditions in the interests of people's well-being, but at keeping the billions of dollars that the oligarchs have stolen from the Ukrainians and are holding in their accounts in Western banks, while reverently accommodating the geopolitical rivals of Russia. Some industrial and financial groups and the parties and politicians on their payroll relied on the nationalists and radicals from the very beginning. Others claimed to be in favor of good relations with Russia and cultural and language diversity, coming to power with the help of their citizens who sincerely supported their declared aspirations, including the millions of people in the southeastern regions. But after getting the positions they coveted, these people immediately betrayed their voters, going back on their election promises, and instead steering a policy prompted by the radicals and sometimes even persecuting their former allies, the public organizations that supported bilingualism and cooperation with Russia. These people took advantage of the fact that their voters were mostly law-abiding citizens with moderate views who trusted the authorities, and that, unlike the radicals, they would not act aggressively or make use of illegal instruments. Meanwhile, the radicals became increasingly brazen in their actions and made more demands every year. They found it easy to force their will on the weak authorities, which were infected with the virus of nationalism and corruption, as well, and which artfully replaced the real cultural, economic, and social interests of the people, and Ukraine's true sovereignty with various ethnic speculations and formal ethnic attributes. A stable statehood is never developed in Ukraine. Its electoral and other political procedures just serve as a cover, a screen for the redistribution of power and property between various oligarchic clans. Corruption, which is certainly a challenge and a problem for many countries, including Russia, has gone beyond the usual scope in Ukraine. It has literally permeated and corroded Ukrainian statehood, the entire system, and all branches of power. Radical nationalists took advantage of the justified public discontent and saddled the Maidan protest, escalating it to a coup d'etat in 2014. They also had direct assistance from foreign states. According to reports, the U.S. Embassy provided $1 million a day to support the so-called protest camp on Independence Square in Kiev. In addition, large amounts were impudently transferred directly to the opposition leaders' bank accounts, tens of millions of dollars. But the people who actually suffered, the families of those who died in the clashes provoked in the streets and squares of Kiev and other cities, how much did they get in the end? It's better not to ask. Nationalists who seized power have unleashed a persecution, a real terror campaign against those who oppose their anti-constitutional actions. Politicians, journalists, and public activists were harassed and publicly humiliated. A wave of violence swept Ukrainian cities, including a series of high-profile and unpunished murders. One shudders at the memories of the terrible tragedy in Odessa, where peaceful protesters were brutally murdered, burned alive in the house of trade unions. The criminals who committed that atrocity have never been punished, and no one's even looking for them. But we know their names, and we will do everything to punish them, find them, and bring them to justice. Maidan did not bring Ukraine any closer to democracy and progress. Having accomplished a coup d'etat, the nationalists and those political forces that supported them eventually led Ukraine into an impasse, pushed the country into the abyss of civil war. 8 years later, the country is split. Ukraine is struggling with an acute socio-economic crisis. According to international organizations, in 2019, almost 6 million Ukrainians, I emphasize, about 15%, not of the workforce, but of the entire population of that country, had to go abroad to find work. Most of them do odd jobs. The following fact is also revealing. Since 2020, over 60,000 doctors and other health workers have left the country amid the pandemic. Since 2014, water bills increased by almost a third, and energy bills grew several times, while the price of gas for households surged several dozen times. Many people simply do not have the money to pay for utilities. They literally struggle to survive. What happened? Why is this all happening? The answer is obvious. They spent and embezzled the legacy inherited not only from the Soviet era, but also from the Russian Empire. They lost tens, hundreds of thousands of jobs which enabled people to earn a reliable income and generate tax revenue. Among other things, thanks to close cooperation with Russia. Sectors including machine building, instrument engineering, electronics, ship and aircraft building have been undermined or destroyed altogether. There was a time, however, when not only Ukraine but the entire Soviet Union took pride in these companies. In 2021, the Black Sea shipyard in Nikolaev went out of business. Its first docks date back to Catherine the Great. Antonov, the famous manufacturer, has not made a single commercial aircraft since 2016, while Yuzhmash, a factory specializing in missile and space equipment, is nearly bankrupt. The Kremenchug steel plant is in a similar situation. The sad list goes on and on. As for the gas transportation system, it was built in its entirety by the Soviet Union, and it has now deteriorated to an extent that using it creates major risks and comes at a high cost for the environment. The situation begs the question: poverty, lack of opportunity, and lost industrial and technological potential. Is this the pro-Western civilizational choice they have been using for many years to fool millions of people with promises of heavenly pastures? It all came down to a Ukrainian economy in tatters and an outright pillage of the country's citizens. While Ukraine itself was placed under external control, directed not only from the Western capitals, but also on the ground, as the saying goes, through an entire network of foreign advisors, NGOs, and other institutions present in Ukraine. They have a direct bearing on all the key appointments and dismissals, and on all branches of power at all levels, from the central government down to municipalities, as well as on state-owned companies and corporations, including Naftogaz, Ukrenergo, Ukrainian Railways, Ukrbprom, Ukposhta, and the Ukrainian Seaports Authority. There is no independent judiciary in Ukraine. The Kiev authorities, at the West's demand, delegated the priority right to select members of the supreme judicial bodies, the Council of Justice and the High Qualifications Commission of Judges, to international organizations. In addition, the United States directly controls the National Agency on Corruption Prevention, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, and the High Anti-Corruption Court. All this is done under the noble pretext of invigorating efforts against corruption. All right, but where are the results? Corruption is flourishing like never before. Are the Ukrainian people aware that this is how their country is managed? Do they realize that their country is turned not even into a political or economic protectorate, but has been reduced to a colony with a puppet regime? The state was privatized. As a result, the government, which designates itself as the power of patriots, no longer acts in a national capacity and consistently pushes Ukraine towards losing its sovereignty. The policy to root out the Russian language and culture and promote assimilation carries on. The Verkhovna Rada has generated a steady flow of discriminatory bills, and the law on the so-called indigenous people has already come into force. People who identify as Russian and want to preserve their identity, language, and culture are getting the signal that they are not wanted in Ukraine. Under the laws on education and the Ukrainian language as a state language, the Russian language has no place in schools or public spaces, even in ordinary shops. The law on the so-called vetting of officials and purging their ranks created a pathway for dealing with unwanted civil servants. There are more and more acts enabling the Ukrainian military and law enforcement agencies to crack down on the freedom of speech, dissent, and going after the opposition. The world knows the deplorable practice of imposing unilateral, illegitimate sanctions against other countries, foreign individuals, and legal entities. Ukraine has outperformed its Western masters by inventing sanctions against its own citizens, companies, television channels, other media outlets, and even members of parliament. Kiev continues to prepare the destruction of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and the Moscow Patriarchate. This is not an emotional judgment. Proof of this can be found in concrete decisions and documents. The Ukrainian authorities have cynically turned the tragedy of the schism into an instrument of state policy. The current authorities do not react to the Ukrainian people's appeals to abolish the laws that are infringing on believers' rights. Moreover, new draft laws directed against the clergy and millions of parishioners of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate have been registered in the Verkhovna Rada. A few words about Crimea. The people of the peninsula freely made their choice to be with Russia. The Kiev authorities cannot challenge the clearly stated choice of the people, which is why they have opted for aggressive action, for activating extremist cells, including radical Islamist organizations, for sending subversives to stage terrorist attacks at critical infrastructure facilities, and for kidnapping Russian citizens. We have factual proof that such aggressive actions are being taken with support from Western security services. In March 2021, a new military strategy was adopted in Ukraine. This document is almost entirely dedicated to confrontation with Russia and sets the goal of involving foreign states in a conflict with our country. The strategy stipulates the organization of what can be described as a terrorist underground movement in Russia's Crimea and in Donbass. It also sets out the contours of a potential war, which should end, according to the Kiev strategists, with the assistance of the international community on favorable terms for Ukraine, as well as, listen carefully please, with foreign military support in the geopolitical confrontation with the Russian Federation. In fact, this is nothing other than preparation for hostilities against our country, Russia. As we know, it has already been stated today that Ukraine intends to create its own nuclear weapons, and this is not just bragging. Ukraine has the nuclear technologies created back in the Soviet times and delivery vehicles for such weapons, including aircraft, as well as the Soviet-designed Doge precision tactical missiles with a range of over 100 kilometers. But they can do more. It is only a matter of time. They have had the groundwork for this since the Soviet era. In other words, acquiring tactical nuclear weapons will be much easier for Ukraine than for some other states, I am not going to mention here, which are conducting such research, especially if Kiev receives foreign technological support. With the appearance of weapons of mass destruction in Ukraine, the situation in the world, in Europe, and especially for us in Russia, would change in the most drastic way. We cannot fail to react to this real danger. I would like to repeat that Western patrons can provide such weapons to Ukraine in order to create another threat to our country. And we can already see how persistently they are flooding the Kiev government with weapons. Since 2014, the United States alone has transferred billions of dollars that include arms supply and training personnel. In recent months, Western weapons have been sent to Ukraine ceaselessly in front of the eyes of the entire world. We are well aware that the activities of the Ukrainian army are governed by foreign consultants. Last year, under the pretext of exercises, NATO military contingents were deployed in Ukraine. The command and control system of the Ukrainian army is already integrated with the NATO ones. This means that the command of the Ukrainian armed forces, even individual units and subunits, can be directly conducted from NATO headquarters. The United States and NATO have begun the shameless development of the territory of Ukraine as a theater of potential military operations. Regular joint exercises have a clear anti-Russian focus. Last year alone, more than 23,000 servicemen and over 1,000 pieces of equipment took part in them. A law has already been adopted on the admission in 2022 of the armed forces of other states to the territory of Ukraine to participate in multinational exercises. It is clear that we are talking primarily about NATO troops, and in the coming year, at least 10 such joint maneuvers are planned. It is obvious that such events serve as a cover for the rapid buildup of the NATO military grouping on the territory of Ukraine. Moreover, the network of airfields modernized with the help of the Americans, Boryspil, Ivano-Frankivsk, Chernihiv, Odessa, and so on, is capable of ensuring the transfer of military units in the shortest possible time. The airspace of Ukraine is open for flights by U.S. strategic and reconnaissance aircraft, unmanned aerial vehicles that are used to monitor the territory of Russia. I will add that the Naval Operations Center in Chekhovo, built by the Americans, makes it possible to monitor the actions of NATO ships, including the use of high-precision weapons against the Russian Black Sea Fleet and our infrastructure along the entire Black Sea coast. At one time, the United States intended to create similar facilities in the Crimea, but the Crimean people thwarted these plans. We will always remember this. I repeat, today such a center has again been already established in Chikovo. Let me remind you that in the 18th century, the soldiers of Alexander Suvorov fought for this city. Thanks to their courage, it became part of Russia. Then, in the 18th century, the lands of the Black Sea region that were annexed to Russia as a result of wars with the Ottoman Empire were called Novorossiya. Now they are trying to consign these milestones of history to oblivion, as well as the names of state military figures of the Russian Empire, without whose work modern Ukraine would not have its cities or even access to the Black Sea. Recently, a monument to Alexander Suvorov was demolished in Poltava. What can one say to this? Are you renouncing your own past? From the so-called colonial heritage of the Russian Empire? Well, then be consistent here. I note that Article 17 of the Constitution of Ukraine does not allow the deployment of foreign military bases on its territory. But it turned out that this is just a convention that can be easily circumvented. Training missions of NATO countries are deployed in Ukraine. These, in fact, are foreign military bases. They just called the base a mission, and the trick is in the bag. Kiev has long proclaimed a strategic course towards joining NATO. Of course, each country has the right to choose its own system of security and conclude military alliances. And everything seems to be so, if not for one but. International documents expressly state the principle of equal and indivisible security, which includes obligations not to strengthen one's security at the expense of the security of other states. I can also refer here to the 1999 OSCE Charter for European Security, adopted in Istanbul, and the 2010 OSCE Astana Declaration. In other words, the choice of ways to ensure security should not pose a threat to other states. If Ukraine was to join NATO, it would serve as a direct threat to Russia's security. Let me remind you that back in April 2008, at the Bucharest summit of the North Atlantic Alliance, the United States pushed through the decision that Ukraine and Georgia would become NATO members. Many European allies of the United States were already well aware of all the risks of such a prospect, but were forced to come to terms with the will of their senior partner. The Americans simply used them to carry out a pronounced anti-Russian policy. A number of member states of the alliance are still very skeptical about the appearance of Ukraine in NATO. At the same time, we receive a signal from some European capitals which say, "What are you worried about? It won't happen literally tomorrow." In fact, our American partners are also talking about this. Well, we answer, if not tomorrow, then the day after tomorrow. What does this change in historical perspective? Basically nothing. Moreover, we know the position and words of the leadership of the United States that active hostilities in eastern Ukraine do not exclude the possibility of this country joining NATO if it can meet the criteria of the North Atlantic Alliance and defeat corruption. At the same time, they try to convince us over and over again that NATO is a peace-loving and purely defensive alliance. So there's no threat to Russia. They keep suggesting we take their word, but we know the real value of such words. In 1990, when the issue of German unification was discussed, the United States promised the Soviet leadership that NATO jurisdiction would not move 1 inch to the east, and that the unification of Germany will not lead to NATO's military expansion to the east. I am quoting here. They talked and gave verbal assurances, but everything turned out to be an empty phrase. Later, they began to assure us that the accession to NATO of the countries of Central and Eastern Europe would only improve relations with Moscow, by relieving these countries of the fears of a heavy historical legacy and even, moreover, create a belt of states friendly to Russia. Everything turned out exactly the opposite. The authorities of some Eastern European countries trading in Russophobia brought their complexes and stereotypes about the Russian threat to the alliance and insisted on building up collective defense networks which should be deployed primarily against Russia. Moreover, this happened in the 1990s and early 2000s when, thanks to openness and our goodwill, relations between Russia and the West were at a high level. Russia has fulfilled all its obligations, including the withdrawal of troops from Germany, from the states of Central and Eastern Europe, and thus has made a huge contribution to overcoming the legacy of the Cold War. We have consistently proposed various options for cooperation, including in the format of the Russia-NATO Council and the OSCE. Moreover, I will say now what I have never said publicly. I will say it for the first time. In 2000, during a visit to Moscow by outgoing U.S. President Bill Clinton, I asked him, how would America feel about having Russia join NATO? I won't reveal all the details of that conversation, but his reaction to my question looked, let's say, very restrained. And how the Americans really reacted to this opportunity can actually be seen in their practical steps toward our country. These were open support for terrorists in the North Caucasus, disregard for our demands and security concerns and NATO expansion, withdrawal from the ABM treaty, and so on. One wants to ask, why? Why all this? For what? Well, you don't want to see us as a friend and ally. But why make an enemy out of us? There is only one answer. It's not about our political regime. It's not about anything else. They just don't need such a big independent country like Russia. This is the answer to all questions. This is the source of the traditional American policy towards Russia, hence the attitude to all our proposals in the field of security. Today, one glance at the map is enough to see how Western countries have kept their promise to prevent NATO from moving eastward. They just lied. We received 5 waves of NATO expansion, one after another. In 1999, Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary were admitted to the alliance. In 2004, Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia in 2009, Albania and Croatia in 2017, Montenegro in 2020, North Macedonia. As a result, the alliance, its military infrastructure, came directly to the borders of Russia. They became one of the key causes of the European security crisis. It had the most negative impact on the entire system of international relations and led to the loss of mutual trust. The situation continues to deteriorate, including in the strategic sphere. Thus, in Romania and Poland, as part of the U.S. project to create a global missile defense system, anti-missile position areas are being deployed. It is well known that the launchers located here can be used for Tomahawk cruise missiles and other strike offensive systems. In addition, the United States is developing the Standard 6 universal missile, which, along with solving the problems of air defense and missile defense, can hit both ground and surface targets. That is, the supposedly defensive U.S. missile defense system is expanding, and new offensive capabilities are emerging. The information we have gives every reason to believe that Ukraine's entry into NATO and the subsequent deployment of NATO facilities here is a foregone conclusion and a matter of time. We clearly understand that under such a scenario, the level of military threats to Russia will rise dramatically, many times over. And I pay special attention. The danger of a sudden strike against our country will increase many times over. Let me explain that the American strategic planning documents contain the possibility of a so-called preemptive strike against enemy missile systems. And who is the main enemy for the US and NATO? We also know it's Russia. NATO documents officially declare our country the main threat to Euro-Atlantic security. And Ukraine will serve as a forward springboard for such a strike. If our ancestors had heard about this, they probably simply would not have believed it. And today we don't want to believe it, but it's true. I want this to be understood both in Russia and in Ukraine. Many Ukrainian airfields are located close to our borders. NATO's tactical aviation stationed here, including carriers of high-precision weapons, will be able to hit our territory to the depth of the Volgograd, Kazan, Samara, Astrakhan line. The deployment of radar reconnaissance assets on the territory of Ukraine will allow NATO to tightly control the airspace of Russia right up to the Urals. Finally, after the United States broke the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the Pentagon is already openly developing a whole range of ground-based strike weapons, including ballistic missiles capable of reaching targets at a distance of up to 5,500 kilometers. If such systems are deployed in Ukraine, they will be able to hit objects throughout the European territory of Russia, as well as beyond the Urals. The flight time to Moscow for Tomahawk cruise missiles will be less than 35 minutes. For ballistic missiles from the Kharkov region, 7 to 8 minutes, and for hypersonic strike weapons, 4 to 5 minutes. This is called bluntly knife to the throat. And they no doubt expect to realize these plans, just as they have repeatedly done in past years, expanding NATO to the east, moving military infrastructure and equipment to Russian borders, completely ignoring our concerns, protests, and warnings. Unfortunately, they just spit on them and did whatever they wanted, whatever they saw fit. And of course, they intend to continue to behave in the same way according to the well-known saying. The dog barks, but the caravan moves on. I will say right away that we did not agree to this and never will agree. At the same time, Russia has always advocated and advocates that the most difficult problems be resolved by political and diplomatic methods at the negotiating table. We are well aware of our colossal responsibility for regional and global stability. Back in 2008, Russia put forward an initiative to conclude a European security treaty. Its meaning was that not a single state and not a single international organization in the Euro-Atlantic could strengthen its security at the expense of the security of others. However, our proposal was rejected out of the blue. It is impossible, they say, to allow Russia to limit the activities of NATO. Moreover, we are explicitly told that only members of the North Atlantic Alliance can have legally binding security guarantees. Last December, we handed over to our Western partners a draft treaty between the Russian Federation and the United States of America on security guarantees, as well as a draft agreement on measures to ensure the security of the Russian Federation and NATO member states. There were many common words in response from the U.S. and NATO. There were some reasonable ideas offered, but all these were secondary concerns. And it looked like an attempt to divert the discussion away from the main issues. We responded to this in an appropriate way, stressing that we are ready to follow the path of negotiations. However, on the condition that all issues are considered in a complex package without separation from the main basic Russian proposals. And they contain three key points. The first is to prevent further NATO expansion. The second is the refusal of the alliance to deploy strike weapon systems on Russian borders. And finally, the return of the bloc's military potential and infrastructure in Europe to the state in 1997 when the Russian NATO Founding Act was signed. It is precisely these fundamental proposals of ours that have been ignored. The Western partners, I repeat, once again, voiced the learned formulas that each state has the right to freely choose ways to ensure its security and enter into any military alliances. That is, nothing has changed in their position. The same references to the notorious open door policy of NATO are heard. Moreover, they are again trying to blackmail us. They are again threatening with sanctions, which, by the way, they will still introduce as Russia's sovereignty strengthens and the power of our armed forces grows. And a pretext for another sanctions attack will always be found or simply fabricated, regardless of the situation in Ukraine. There is only one goal: to restrain the development of Russia. And they will do it, as they did before, even without any formal pretext at all, only because we will never concede our sovereignty or national interests or values. I would like to say clearly and directly, in the current situation, when our proposals for an equal dialogue on fundamental issues have actually gone unanswered by the United States and NATO, when the level of threats to our country is growing significantly, Russia has every right to take retaliatory measures to ensure its own security. That is exactly what we will do. And for the state of affairs in the Donbass, we see that the ruling elite in Kiev constantly and publicly declares its unwillingness to implement the Minsk package of measures to resolve the conflict, and is not interested in a peaceful solution. On the contrary, it is trying to organize a blitzkrieg in the Donbass again. And it already happened in 2014 and 2015. How these adventures ended then, we remember. Now, not a single day goes by without shelling of settlements in Donbass. The large, formed military groups constantly use attack drones, heavy equipment, rockets, artillery, and multiple rocket launchers. The killing of civilians, the blockade, the mockery of people, including children, women, the elderly, does not stop. As we say, there is no end in sight to this. And the so-called civilized world, of which our Western colleagues self-appointedly declared themselves to be the only representatives, prefers not to notice this, as if all this horror, the genocide, to which almost 4 million people are subjected, does not exist, and only because these people did not agree with the supported West coup in Ukraine in 2014. They opposed the aggressive and primitive nationalism and neo-Nazism that was elevated to the rank of state government. And they are fighting for their basic rights, to live on their own land, to speak their own language, to preserve their culture and traditions. How long can this tragedy continue? How much longer can they endure this? Russia has done everything to preserve the territorial integrity of Ukraine all these years, persistently and patiently fought for the implementation of UN Security Council Resolution 2202 of February 17, 2015, which consolidated the Minsk package of measures of February 12, 2015 to resolve the situation in Donbass. Everything is in vain. Presidents and Rada deputies change, but the essence, the aggressive nationalistic character of the regime itself, which seized power in Kiev, remains. It is entirely and completely a product of the 2014 coup d'etat, and those who then embarked on the path of violence, bloodshed, lawlessness, did not recognize and do not recognize any other solution to the Donbass issue except for the military one. In this regard, I consider it necessary to take a long overdue decision to immediately recognize the independence and sovereignty of the Donetsk People's Republic and the Lugansk People's Republic. I ask the Federal Assembly of the Russian Federation to support this decision and then ratify the Treaty of Friendship and Mutual Assistance with both republics. These two documents will be prepared and signed in the very near future. And from those who seized and hold power in Kiev, we demand an immediate cessation of hostilities. Otherwise, all responsibility for the possible continuation of the bloodshed will be entirely on the conscience of the regime ruling on the territory of Ukraine. Announcing the decisions taken today, I am confident in the support of the citizens of Russia, all the patriotic forces of the country. Thank you for your attention. All right. So, we got another one in. For those Americans that would never read subtitles, I just made you an audiobook from history. That's from a year ago, February 21st, 2022. I'm going back through Michael Rossi's old videos just to give us some context and help us see how far we've come. You know, did he predict what's going to happen? I noticed a lot of things in there that happened exactly how he said they would. Meanwhile, you look at the American side. Has everything they said happened? I think Biden said he would never send tanks to the Ukraine, and now they're gearing up for Abrams, right? Victoria Nuland is giggling about what is it? The pipeline being a hunk of metal at the bottom of the sea. Was it Ted Cruz? The name of it's slipping my mind. I know it's number 2, Nord Stream 2. So there you go. If you want to support anybody for making this video, please support Michael Rossi first. I like to think we are both doing this in a certain kind of spirit to educate people, especially in America, about what's going on the other side of the world. He spent probably 10 hours on that translation. So he made the translation, and his Patreon is in the description. I really appreciate you, Dr. Rossi. I sincerely think you're doing the Lord's work, and I just want to go back through and try to popularize those videos as much as I can, because I think they are so important as the current administration rattles the sabers for World War III. So I have 2 beautiful daughters, and I do not want them to be irradiated. Please, Lord. Okay? So if you want to support anybody, support Michael Rossi. His Patreon's below. Please follow his YouTube channel, Michael Rossi, Poli. And if you got anything left over, my stuff's down there too. There's a Patreon, and Buy Me a Coffee's my favorite. I like the orange and the brown, but anyway, I've been on here a long time tonight. I'm going to go up and crawl into bed, and I'll see y'all tomorrow. I love you. God bless. Let's prevent World War III. We got so much to live for, and it's dumb. Let's all just live in peace and get rich together. Amen.